April 1917, Vimy Ridge Sector, Western Front, France. The sun was just starting to come up over the muddy trenches. A German sniper named Otto Schneider pressed his eye against a trench periscope. He moved very slowly. Every movement had to be careful. His hands were shaking, but not because of the cold morning air. Otto Schneider was afraid. He looked across the empty land between the German and Canadian trenches. It was about 200 yards of mud, broken trees, and shell holes filled with dirty water. Somewhere on the other side, in the Canadian trenches, a sniper was watching, waiting, hunting. Otto knew this because of what had happened in the past week. 7 German snipers had been killed. All of them died the same way, one bullet, right through the head. The German soldiers had started calling this sector something terrible. They called it Todesstreifen. In English, that means the death strip. Just 3 days ago, Otto had watched his friend Karl take up a sniper position. Karl was good at his job. He had killed 32 enemy soldiers. He knew how to hide. He knew how to stay safe. But Karl made one small mistake. He looked through his scope for just a few seconds too long. A Canadian bullet found him. Karl never even heard the shot that killed him. This is the story of why German snipers learned to fear the Canadian sectors more than any other place on the Western Front. This is the story of how one nation turned sniping from an art into a science. The Canadians hunted German snipers the way a farmer hunts foxes. They were patient. They were careful. They were deadly. By the spring of 1917, the war in Europe had been going on for almost 3 years. Millions of men sat in trenches that stretched from the ocean in Belgium all the way to Switzerland. The war had stopped moving. Both armies were stuck. They faced each other across narrow strips of destroyed land. Nobody could win. Nobody could lose. Soldiers just kept dying. In this terrible stalemate, snipers became very important. They controlled the empty land between the trenches. A good sniper could make enemy soldiers afraid to lift their heads. He could kill officers. He could destroy morale. On the Western Front, the average sniper lived for only 6 weeks before he was killed or wounded. But something different was happening in the sectors held by Canadian soldiers. German snipers were dying 3 times faster there. Some German snipers died within their first week. The math was brutal and clear. Being a sniper opposite the Canadians was almost a death sentence. Between 1915 and 1918, Canadian snipers killed more than 3,000 German soldiers. That number was confirmed. The real number was probably much higher. German Army reports specifically warned new snipers about what they called the Canadian problem. German commanders knew which parts of the front line were held by Canadians. They dreaded sending their men there. One German officer was captured by British troops. In his diary, soldiers found something shocking. He had written, "We fear their snipers more than their artillery." Think about that. The Germans were more afraid of Canadian rifles than they were of the massive cannons that fired shells as big as trash cans. That tells you how deadly the Canadian snipers really were. Otto Schneider had read the warnings. He had heard the stories. Other German soldiers talked in whispers about the Canadians. They said the Canadians could see in the dark. They said the Canadians never missed. They said the Canadians kept notebooks where they wrote down every kill, like hunters tracking deer. Some of these stories sounded crazy, but Otto had seen the bodies. He had watched 7 of his fellow snipers die in 7 days. The stories didn't seem crazy anymore. He pulled back from the periscope and sat down in the muddy trench. His rifle sat next to him, clean and ready. But Otto didn't want to use it. Every time a German sniper fired at the Canadian lines, the Canadians found him. It might take an hour, it might take a day, but they always found him. And then that German sniper was dead. The other German soldiers in the trench were waking up now. They moved slowly, staying low. Everyone knew the rules. Don't stand up. Don't look over the trench wall. Don't make yourself a target. The Canadians were always watching. A young soldier named Friedrich crawled over to Otto. "Did you see anything?" he whispered. Otto shook his head. "I don't want to see anything. The more you look, the more they see you." Friedrich looked confused. "But you're a sniper. You're supposed to look. You're supposed to shoot." "Not at Canadians," Otto said quietly. "Not if you want to live." The sun was fully up now. Another day had started in the death strip. Somewhere across no man's land, the Canadian snipers were already at work. They had probably been watching since before dawn. They knew every inch of the German trenches. They had mapped every sandbag, every firing position, every place where a German soldier might show his face. Otto thought about the stories he had heard. The Canadians didn't just wait for targets. They hunted. They used teams of men who watched and recorded everything. They used tricks to make German snipers fire and give away their positions. Then they killed those German snipers with cold, patient skill. German high command had started pulling veteran snipers from other parts of the front line. They sent them to fight the Canadians. Those veteran snipers died too. Nothing seemed to work. The Canadians were just better at this deadly game. Otto looked at his rifle again. He thought about his wife back in Germany. He thought about his little daughter, who was only 3 years old. He wondered if he would ever see them again. He wondered how long he could survive in this sector where Canadian snipers ruled like invisible ghosts. The question haunted every German sniper on the Western Front. What made the Canadian approach to sniping so deadly that German commanders began requesting transfers away from Canadian-held sectors? What turned these soldiers from a quiet country into the most feared hunters on the battlefield? When Canada entered the First World War in August 1914, something unusual happened. The Canadian Army was made up of volunteers. These were not city boys who had never held a gun. Most of them came from farms and small towns across Canada. Many came from the wild forests and prairies of the frontier. They were hunters. They were trappers. They were men who knew how to track animals through the woods. They knew how to stay quiet and patient. They knew how to make a single shot count because bullets cost money, and you couldn't waste them when hunting for food. These skills seemed old-fashioned in 1914. The war was supposed to be about big armies and modern weapons. Nobody thought that hunting skills would matter much, but they were wrong. The Canadian soldiers arrived in France in early 1915. They were excited and ready to fight, but they quickly learned that war was not what they expected. The Germans had snipers who were very good at their jobs. These German snipers had excellent equipment. Their rifle scopes were made by a company called Zeiss. These scopes were the best in the world. The German snipers also had good training. They knew how to hide. They knew how to kill. In April 1915, the Canadians fought at a place called Ypres in Belgium. It was a terrible battle. The Germans used poison gas for the first time. Thousands of men died. But something else happened that the history books don't always mention. In just 2 weeks, 312 Canadian soldiers were shot by German snipers. That's more than 20 men killed or wounded every single day. The Canadians couldn't even lift their heads above the trench walls. One Canadian private wrote a letter home. He said, "You couldn't lift your head for 5 seconds without Jerry taking a shot." Jerry was what they called the Germans. The Canadian soldiers felt helpless. They were being picked off one by one. They couldn't see the German snipers. They couldn't fight back. But the Canadian commanders didn't just accept this. They didn't say, "Well, that's just how war is." Instead, they decided to fix the problem. They decided to be smart about it. The commander was a man named Major General Arthur Currie. He was a teacher before the war, not a professional soldier. Maybe that's why he thought differently. He looked at the sniper problem like a math problem. How do you stop losing men? You kill the enemy snipers first. In the fall of 1915, the Canadians started building special schools behind the front lines. These schools taught men how to be snipers, but they taught something more than just shooting. They taught a whole system. A man named Major Hesketh Pritchard ran these schools. Before the war, he had been a big game hunter in Africa and India. He knew how to hunt lions and tigers. Now he would teach men how to hunt other men. The Canadian system had three parts. First, they had observer teams. These men spent days and days just watching the German trenches. They didn't shoot. They just watched. They wrote down everything they saw. If a German soldier appeared in the same spot twice, they wrote it down. If they saw a shadow that looked wrong, they wrote it down. They made maps showing every German position. Second, they had decoy specialists. These brave men used fake heads made of wood and cloth. They put these fake heads on sticks and raised them above the trench walls. When a German sniper shot at the fake head, the Canadians could see where the shot came from. They used mirrors to create movement that looked real. They made sounds that tricked the Germans into shooting. Every time a German sniper fired, he gave away his position. Third, they had elimination teams. These teams always worked in pairs. One man was the spotter. He used binoculars to watch and find targets. The other man was the shooter. He took the actual shot. They used all the information from the observers and the decoys. They knew exactly where the German snipers were hiding. Then they killed them. By early 1916, before the big battle at the Somme, the difference was clear. In a normal British or French sector, you might see 2 or 3 sniper kills in a whole day. The Canadians were killing 8 to 10 German snipers every single day. That's almost 300 kills every month. The men who became Canadian snipers were special. A man named Francis Pagamaggabo was an Ojibwe Indian from Ontario. Before the war, he worked as a guide in the wilderness. He would become the deadliest sniper of the entire war. Another man named Henry Norwest was Métis, which means he had both European and Native American blood. He grew up on the Canadian frontier. A man named Herbert McBride came from Arkansas in America. He crossed into Canada just so he could join the war. He was a hunting guide who wanted to test his skills. These men kept detailed notebooks. Every time they killed an enemy sniper, they wrote it down. They recorded the time, the place, the wind conditions, how far the shot was. They treated killing like a science, not like luck. All of this information went to the division commanders. The commanders studied it. They looked for patterns. They could predict where German snipers would appear next. A British officer visited the Canadian trenches in 1916. He watched how the Canadians worked. He wrote in his report, "They hunt men the way a gamekeeper hunts foxes. They are systematic, patient, and scientific." He was right. The Canadians had turned warfare into something cold and calculated. They had brought the skills of the wilderness to the modern battlefield, and those skills were about to change the war. In 1915 and early 1916, German snipers felt almost like kings of the battlefield. They had the best equipment in the world, their rifle. Their scopes were made in Germany by the Zeiss company. These scopes let them see farther and clearer than anyone else. The German snipers also had better training than most Allied soldiers. They knew all the tricks. They knew how to build hiding spots that couldn't be seen. They knew how to wait for hours without moving. And in most places on the Western Front, they held the high ground. They could look down on the British and French trenches. A German sniper named Joseph Allerberger wrote about this time years later. He said that in early 1916, German snipers felt almost invincible when they were shooting at British and French targets. They could kill enemy soldiers almost whenever they wanted. The British and French tried to fight back, but they weren't very good at it yet. The Germans were winning the sniper war. But then something started to change. It started in February 1916. A German regiment from Bavaria took over a section of trenches near a town called Neuville-Saint-Vaast. These were good soldiers. They had fought in other battles. They thought this would be a normal rotation. They would spend a few weeks in the trenches, lose some men to artillery and raids, then rotate back for rest. That's how it usually worked. But these trenches were opposite the Canadian 2nd Division. Within 48 hours, 4 German snipers were dead. The German commanders were confused. What was happening? German snipers didn't die this fast. Within a week, 9 more German snipers were wounded or killed. 13 casualties in 1 week. That was impossible. That wasn't supposed to happen. One of those German snipers was a man named Lieutenant Klaus Weber. He was an officer and a very good sniper. He had killed 21 enemy soldiers. He knew what he was doing. When Weber arrived at this sector, he decided to be extra careful. He spent 3 days preparing his position. He worked only at night so nobody could see him. He built his firing hole very slowly, 1 sandbag at a time. He camouflaged it with mud and broken wood. He watched the Canadian trenches through a periscope. He learned their patterns. He saw where they moved. He picked out his killing zone. By March 1916, Weber felt ready. His position was perfect. Nobody could see it. He had a clear view of a section of Canadian trench about 180 yards away. That was an easy shot for a man of his skill. On the morning of his attack, Weber woke up before dawn. The air was cold and damp. Mist hung over no man's land like a blanket. The smell of mud and old explosives filled his nose. Far away, he could hear the rumble of artillery. But here, in this section, everything was quiet. At 6:47 in the morning, Weber saw his chance. A Canadian soldier stood up to look over the trench, just for a moment, just long enough. Weber fired. The bullet hit the Canadian in the shoulder. Not a kill, but a solid hit. The Canadian fell back into his trench, wounded. Weber immediately moved to his second position, just like he had been trained. You never stay in one place after firing. That was the first rule. He felt good. His camouflage had worked. His shot had been clean. But then, 90 seconds after Weber's shot, something terrible happened. 3 Canadian bullets hit within inches of where Weber had been. The bullets smashed into the sandbags. They tore through his carefully built position. Weber pressed himself flat into the mud. His heart was pounding. How did they know? How did they find his position so fast? His camouflage was perfect. He had only fired once. He had moved immediately. This was impossible. What Weber didn't know was that the Canadians had been watching his section of trench for an entire week. They had mapped every single sandbag. They had noted every shadow. They had written down every tiny change. They had seen Weber working at night. They knew something was there. They just didn't know exactly where. Weber's single shot gave them the final piece of information they needed. Now they knew exactly where he was. At 7:02 in the morning, a Canadian sniper named Corporal Francis Pegahmagabo settled into position. He was 220 yards from Weber's hiding spot. That was a long shot, but Pegahmagabo was the best. He had killed dozens of German snipers. He understood wind, he understood distance, he understood patience. He looked through his scope. He could see the damaged sandbags where Weber was hiding. He could see a tiny bit of shadow that didn't quite match the rest of the trench. That shadow was Weber's head. Pegahmagabo fired once. The bullet flew across no man's land. It hit Lieutenant Klaus Weber in the temple. Weber died instantly. He never knew what happened. He never heard the shot. One moment he was alive. planning his next move. The next moment, he was dead. The German soldiers in the trench didn't recover Weber's body for 3 days. It was too dangerous to move in that section. The Canadians were watching. When they finally got Weber's body, they found his notebook. It listed 21 confirmed kills. It would be his last entry. Word spread quickly through the German trenches. Another sniper dead. Another good man killed by the Canadians. The German soldiers stopped talking loudly. They stopped looking through periscopes. They kept their heads down. Everyone understood now. Fighting the Canadians was different. Fighting the Canadians meant death. By the spring of 1917, the Germans had learned to fear Canadian snipers. But everything that had happened before was just practice. The real test came at a place called Vimy Ridge. This was a long hill in northern France. The Germans had held it since 1914. They had turned it into a fortress. The French had tried to take it twice. Both times they failed. Thousands of French soldiers died trying to climb that ridge. The Germans thought it could never be taken. But in April 1917, the Canadian Corps was ordered to capture Vimy Ridge. The commanders knew it would be hard. The Germans could see everything from the top of the ridge. They had machine guns, they had artillery, and they had snipers who could shoot down at the Canadian trenches. If the Canadians tried to attack, those German snipers would kill hundreds of men before the battle even started. So the Canadians decided to do something that had never been done before. They called it Operation Silent Death. The plan was simple but brutal. Before the main attack, Canadian snipers would hunt down and kill every single German sniper on the ridge. Every single one. For 2 weeks before the attack, Canadian observers watched the German positions. They used binoculars and telescopes. They made maps. They drew pictures. They wrote down everything. By early April, they had identified 127 places where German snipers were hiding. They knew where every German sniper worked. They knew what times they were active. They knew their patterns and habits. The Canadians even built models out of clay showing the German trenches. They used these models to plan where their own snipers would shoot from. The hunt began on April 6th at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark. The air was cold and smelled like rain. Fog covered no man's land. In that darkness, 89 Canadian snipers moved into position. These were the best shots in the entire Canadian Corps. Each man knew his target. Each man had specific German snipers to eliminate. Their orders were clear and cold. Kill all enemy snipers before 0 hour. Nothing else mattered more. The sun came up slowly that morning. The first German sniper died at 5:17 in the morning. He had been watching the Canadian trenches, looking for targets. He never saw the Canadian bullet that killed him. By noon, 17 more German snipers were dead. By the time the sun went down on April 6th, 43 German snipers had been killed. 43 in a single day. The German commanders couldn't believe what was happening. They sent desperate radio messages asking for help. One message said, "We are blind. They are killing our eyes." Without their snipers, the Germans couldn't see what the Canadians were doing. They couldn't watch for signs of an attack. They couldn't spot Canadian movements. They were fighting blind. On the second day, April 7th, the Germans tried something new. They brought in their best snipers from other parts of the front line. These were veteran killers, men who had 50 or 60 or even 100 kills, men who had survived years of war. The German commanders thought these experts could stop the Canadians. They were wrong. The Canadian snipers were waiting. They knew the Germans would send reinforcements. They had studied the maps. They knew which routes the German snipers would use to reach their positions. The Canadians set up ambushes along those routes. When the veteran German snipers arrived, they walked right into Canadian killing zones. By the end of the second day, 21 more German snipers were dead. These weren't new soldiers. These were the best snipers Germany had, and the Canadians killed them like they were nothing. On the third day, April 8th, something changed. The German snipers stopped shooting. They stopped trying to observe the Canadian lines. They just hid. They stayed in their bunkers and dugouts. They were too afraid to do their jobs. The fear had become too much. Every German sniper knew that if they looked through a scope, if they raised their head, if they tried to take a shot, they would die. The Canadians had broken their will completely. Canadian scouts reported that whole sections of the German trenches had gone quiet. Nobody was watching. Nobody was observing. The Germans were blind, and they knew it. One captured German soldier told his interrogators, "We cannot see them, but they see everything. Our snipers are dead or too frightened to shoot. We are defending a position we cannot observe. God help us when they attack." On April 9th at 5:30 in the morning, the final moment came. The big Canadian attack was about to begin. All along the Canadian trenches, thousands of soldiers prepared to go over the top and charge toward Vimy Ridge. The artillery was ready to start its massive bombardment. But before any of that happened, one last shot needed to be taken. Corporal Francis Pagamagabo was lying in a forward position. This was a small trench that stuck out closer to the German lines. He was only 80 yards from the enemy. Through the dim light of early morning, he saw movement. A German officer had climbed up to look at the Canadian trenches through binoculars. This officer wanted to see where the Canadians were. He wanted to see if an attack was coming. He was trying to do the job that his dead snipers could no longer do. Pagamagabo didn't hesitate. He aimed. He fired. 80 yards, one shot. The German officer fell backward into his trench. The German soldiers near him didn't even try to help. They had learned their lesson. Trying to help sniper victims just got more people killed. They left the officer where he fell. At exactly 5:30, the Canadian artillery opened fire. Thousands of shells screamed through the air and exploded on Vimy Ridge. The ground shook. The noise was so loud it could be heard in England, across the ocean. Behind that wall of explosions, Canadian soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began to advance. The German defenders were already beaten. They had been fighting blind for 3 days. They didn't know where the Canadians were. They didn't know how many were coming. They couldn't coordinate their defense because they had no observation. The sniper campaign had worked perfectly. By killing roughly 70 German snipers in the weeks before the battle, the Canadians had destroyed the German ability to defend the ridge. Over the next 4 days, the Canadians captured Vimy Ridge. They did it, with fewer casualties than anyone expected. German reports after the battle specifically mention complete loss of observation capability as a main reason for their defeat. The snipers had won the battle before the soldiers ever fired a shot. One bullet at a time, the Canadians had made victory possible. After Vimy Ridge fell in April 1917, the German High Command had to face a terrible truth. Their snipers were being destroyed in sectors held by Canadians. The losses were so bad that something had to change. Within just a few days of Vimy, the German army group, Crown Prince, sent out an order. It was called Directive 47. The order said that German snipers were not allowed to shoot at Canadian positions unless a company commander gave them special permission first. Think about what that means. The Germans were so afraid of Canadian snipers that they told their own snipers to stop doing their jobs. The casualty rate was too high. The Germans couldn't afford to keep losing men this way. The human cost of the Vimy sniper campaign tells two very different stories. On the Canadian side, the numbers were surprisingly small. 12 Canadian snipers were killed during the entire Vimy period. 8 more were wounded. That's 20 casualties total. For a campaign that lasted weeks and involved nearly 90 snipers, those numbers were incredibly low. The Canadian system worked. Their emphasis on camouflage, on patience, on careful position security kept their men alive. Corporal Francis Pegamagabo wrote in his journal after the battle. His words were simple but proud. He wrote, "We took 43 of theirs. They took none of ours. This is how you win." He was right. The Canadians had hunted the Germans without mercy, but they had also protected their own men. That's what good leadership looks like in war. The German side of the story was very different. Between January and May 1917, German forces opposite the Canadian Corps lost more than 200 snipers. That was 40% of all the trained snipers they had on that entire section of the Western Front. 40%. Almost half their sniper force was gone, dead or wounded or too scared to fight. These weren't just numbers. These were skilled men who had taken months to train. They couldn't be replaced quickly. Every dead German sniper made the German army weaker. A German sergeant was captured during the battle. British soldiers interrogated him. They asked him why the Germans had lost. The sergeant was angry and bitter. He said, "You see, you Canadians don't fight like Europeans. You fight like Indians." He meant it as an insult. He was trying to say the Canadians didn't fight fair, didn't fight with honor. But the Canadians who heard about this comment just laughed. They took it as a compliment. They were proud of it. Yes, they fought like hunters from the wilderness. That's exactly what made them so good. The German soldiers wrote about their fear in letters and diaries. One diary from the 16th Bavarian Division was found after the war. The entry from April 15, 1917 told the whole story. It said, "Sniper losses in the Canadian sector have reached critical levels. Replacement snipers are arriving inadequately trained and are being killed within days of deployment. Morale among scout and observation units is dangerously low." The writer of that diary entry understood what was happening. The Germans were losing the sniper war badly. The Canadian commanders also wrote reports. The Canadian Corps Intelligence Summary from April 20th said that enemy sniper activity had decreased by 87% across all their divisions. 87%. The Germans had almost completely stopped using snipers against the Canadians. The report also said that captured prisoners reported widespread fear of Canadian snipers. Several German prisoners said they had intentionally let themselves be captured. They would rather be prisoners of war than stay in trenches opposite Canadian snipers. Being a prisoner was safer than being a soldier facing the Canadians. Even the British noticed what the Canadians had done. The British War Office wrote a report in May 1917. It said, "The Canadian approach to counter-sniper operations represents the most effective doctrine observed on the Western Front. Recommend adoption of Canadian methods across all BEF divisions." That was high praise. The British were basically saying everyone should learn from the Canadians. They figured out how to win. But war is not just about numbers and tactics. It's about people. And even in this cold, efficient killing, there were moments of humanity. An American volunteer named Herbert McBride was fighting with the Canadians. After Vimy, he was checking the battlefield. He found a German sniper position. Inside, there was a photo of a woman and 2 children. The photo showed the German sniper's family, his wife, his daughters. McBride looked at that photo for a long time. Later, he wrote, "He was just a man doing his job like me, but he chose the wrong sector to do it in. I felt sorry for his family, but not sorry enough to stop." Another German soldier named Heinrich Becker survived the war. Many years later, he told his story. He said, "I was a machine gunner, not a sniper, thank God. I watched 3 of my comrades die with single shots to the head, all from the Canadian lines. We stopped looking through periscopes. We stopped observing. We just kept our heads down and prayed the Canadians wouldn't attack. You can hear the fear in his words even years after the war ended. The memory of those Canadian snipers haunted him for the rest of his life. By the summer of 1917, German soldiers all across the Western Front knew which sectors were held by Canadians. They could tell by the uniforms, by the accents, by the maple leaf symbols, and they dreaded being sent to face them. The reputation wasn't just about snipers anymore. It was about an entire army that fought with calculated lethality. The Canadians had proven something important. They had shown that discipline, training, and smart tactics could beat even the best equipment and the strongest positions. The Germans had started the war thinking they were superior soldiers. They had better training, better equipment, better tactics. But the Canadians had beaten them at their own game. They had taken the Germans' own weapon, the sniper, and used it better than the Germans ever could. And now the entire German army knew it. Fear spread from sector to sector. The word Canadian became something that made German soldiers nervous. That fear, built one careful shot at a time, would last for the rest of the war. The systematic killing of German snipers in Canadian sectors did more than just win battles. It changed the entire war in ways that nobody expected. When you kill a sniper, you don't just remove one soldier from the battlefield. You remove the eyes of an entire army. And that's what happened to the Germans in 1917 and 1918. Without their snipers, German commanders lost something critical. They lost real-time intelligence. They couldn't see what the Canadians were doing anymore. They couldn't watch Canadian trenches for signs of an attack. They couldn't count how many soldiers were moving. They couldn't spot where the Canadians were weak or strong. In war, information is power. The Germans had lost their power to see, and that made everything harder for them. This blindness helped the Canadians win battle after battle. At Hill 70 in August 1917, the Canadians attacked German positions. The Germans were surprised by where the attack came. They were surprised by how strong it was. They couldn't respond quickly because they hadn't seen it coming. The same thing happened at Passchendaele in October and November 1917. The Canadians attacked through terrible mud and rain. The Germans should have been able to defend better. But without their snipers watching, they were always one step behind. The German defensive system depended on aggressive observation. Their doctrine said that soldiers should constantly watch the enemy trenches. They should harass enemy soldiers. They should make the enemy afraid to move. But in Canadian sectors, the Germans couldn't do any of this. It was too dangerous. Any German soldier who looked over the trench wall risked getting shot in the head. So German soldiers became passive. They stopped watching. They stopped harassing. They just hid and hoped the Canadians wouldn't attack. That's not how you win a war. The sniper problem also drained German resources. The German high command had to pull veteran snipers from other parts of the Western Front. They needed to send these experienced men to fight the Canadians, but when they did this, it created gaps in other sectors. British and French forces noticed that German sniping in their areas got worse. There were fewer German snipers watching them. This made life easier for British and French soldiers. By forcing the Germans to concentrate snipers against the Canadians were actually helping their allies without even knowing it. The Canadian method started to spread to other armies. By late 1917, the British adopted Canadian sniper training techniques. They sent British officers to Canadian sniper schools to learn. The British realized that the old way of doing things wasn't working. The Canadians had figured out something better, something more effective. When American soldiers arrived in France in 1918, they specifically asked for Canadian instructors. The Americans wanted to learn from the best. Major Hesketh Pritchard, the man who had built the Canadian sniper system, became famous. His methods became the standard for all Allied forces. The Germans tried to adapt and fight back. They issued special steel face shields to their snipers. These shields were supposed to protect against bullets, but they were heavy and uncomfortable. They reduced visibility. A sniper wearing one of these shields couldn't see as well or move as quickly. The shields made German snipers less effective, which was exactly the opposite of what the Germans wanted. The Germans also changed their tactics. They ordered snipers to work in groups of 3 instead of alone or in pairs. The idea was that 3 men could protect each other better, but this didn't work either. 3 snipers in one place just meant 3 targets for the Canadians to hunt, and when the Canadians found them, all 3 died instead of just 1. The Germans also started emphasizing camouflage over actually shooting. They told their snipers to hide first and shoot second. This kept more German snipers alive, but it also meant they weren't doing their jobs. A sniper who's too afraid to shoot isn't really a sniper anymore. None of these German adaptations worked against the Canadian systematic hunting methods. The Canadians were just too organized, too patient, too skilled. They had turned sniping into a science. The Germans were still treating it like an art. The impact on morale was enormous on both sides. Canadian soldiers felt proud and confident. They knew their snipers controlled no man's land. They knew that when they attacked, their snipers had already blinded the enemy. This confidence made Canadian soldiers braver. They were more willing to take risks. They surrendered less often. General Arthur Currie, who commanded the Canadian Corps, understood this. He said, "A soldier who knows his snipers control no man's land will walk into battle differently." He was right. The Canadian soldiers walked taller. They fought harder. They believed they were better than the enemy, and that belief became reality. German morale went the other direction. German soldiers became afraid and anxious. Allied intelligence intercepted German letters and communications. These letters showed deep fear. One letter from a German private named Hans Meyer was written in March 1918. He wrote, "The Canadians are opposite us again. We have been issued extra rations and told to prepare for difficult duty. Men are writing letters home in case of the worst." Extra rations meant the German commanders expected high casualties. Writing goodbye letters meant the soldiers expected to die. That's not how an army wins. The numbers tell the story clearly. In sectors held by the British, German snipers killed about 1.2 Allied snipers every week, while losing about the same number themselves. The battle was even. In French sectors, it was about the same. Both sides killed about 0.9 snipers per week. Again, roughly even. But in Canadian sectors, the math was completely different. Canadian snipers killed 7.3 German snipers every week, while losing only 0.4 of their own. That's a ratio of 18 to 1. For every Canadian sniper who died, 18 German snipers died. That kind of dominance changes everything. German General Erich Ludendorff commanded German forces for much of the war. After the war ended, he wrote his memoirs. In them, he admitted something important. He wrote, "The Canadian Corps was the most formidable fighting force we faced on the Western Front. Their approach to warfare, systematic, patient, ruthless, represented a new kind of soldier. They did not simply fight battles. They dismantled our ability to fight back." Behind all the numbers and tactics were real people. Each sniper had a name, a story, a life before the war. Some survived, some didn't. Their stories show us that war is always about human beings, not just strategies and statistics. The deadliest sniper of the entire First World War was a man named Francis Pigamagabo. He was an Ojibwe Indian from Parry Sound, Ontario. In his life, He killed 378 enemy soldiers. That number was confirmed. The real number might have been higher, but Pega-Magabo was more than just a number. Before the war, Pega-Magabo worked as a wilderness guide. He took city people into the forests of Ontario to hunt and fish. His grandfather had taught him traditional hunting skills. Pega-Magabo said, "My grandfather taught me that hunting is not about the kill. It's about understanding your prey better than it understands itself." He brought this wisdom to the war. He studied German snipers the way he once studied deer and moose. He learned their habits. He predicted their movements. He was patient and careful and deadly. After the war ended in 1918, Pega-Magabo went home to the Wasauksing First Nation. He fought for indigenous rights. He fought to get better treatment for Native veterans. The Canadian government gave him the military medal with 2 bars. This was an honor, but not a big one. Other soldiers who accomplished far less received higher awards. Pega-Magabo died in 1952. Most Canadians had never heard of him. It took until 2016, 64 years after his death, for Canada to really honor him. They named a Navy ship after him, HMCS Pega-Magabo. Finally, his name would be remembered. Another great Canadian sniper was Henry Norwest. He was Métis, which meant he had both European and native blood. He came from Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. Norwest killed 115 German soldiers that we know about. But unlike some snipers, Norwest didn't talk about his work. He didn't keep detailed diaries. He didn't write letters describing his kills. He just did his job quietly and professionally. A soldier who served with Norwest remembered him this way. Henry never boasted. He'd come back from a mission, clean his rifle, eat his ration, and sleep. The next morning, you'd hear that 3 German snipers had been found dead in positions they'd held for weeks. Henry never said a word. That was the kind of man Norwest was. Quiet, humble, deadly. On August 18, 1918, Henry Norwest was killed by a German sniper. It was 85 days before the war ended. He was 33 years old. His grave is in France, in a place called Warvillers. The grave has a simple white cross with his name on it. Thousands of miles from home. Thousands of miles from Alberta. Not all the Canadian snipers were from Canada. Herbert McBride was an American from Arkansas. He crossed the border into Canada in 1914 just so he could join the war. He was a skilled hunter and marksman. He saw the war as the ultimate test of his abilities. He wanted to prove he was the best. McBride survived the war. He killed 115 men that he knew of. After the war, he wrote a book called A Rifleman Went to War. In that book, he tried to explain what it felt like to kill so many people. He wrote, "A sniper is not a murderer. He's a soldier using skill instead of luck. Every shot I took potentially saved 10 Allied lives by removing an enemy who would have killed without discrimination." But he also wrote this, "I killed 115 men. Some were snipers who would have killed my comrades. Some were officers directing attacks. Some were machine gunners. Each death was deliberate, calculated, necessary. I don't regret a single one, but I remember every face." That last part is important. He remembered every face. That's the burden snipers carry. The war hurt German families too. A German sniper named Klaus Weber died in 1916, shot by Corporal Pega-Magabo. Weber's wife was named Maria. She got a letter telling her that her husband was dead. 30 years later, a historian interviewed her. She told him, "Klaus was an excellent marksman. He won competitions before the war. He was confident, skilled, careful. He wrote me that he was being sent to a quiet sector near Neuville-Saint-Vaast. His last letter said he'd found a perfect position and expected to return home safely. The next letter was from his commanding officer. Klaus was killed his first day in that position. Later, I learned the quiet sector was held by Canadians. I learned what that meant. Not. All the heroes were snipers. Some men had even more dangerous jobs. Private James MacDonald of the 1st Canadian Division was a decoy man. His job was to trick German snipers into shooting so that Canadian snipers could find them and kill them. He used fake heads made of wood and cloth. He used mirrors. Sometimes he used his own body, exposing himself briefly to draw fire. For 2 years, MacDonald's decoy work helped eliminate 67 German snipers. He was wounded 3 times doing this incredibly dangerous work. Each time he recovered and went back to the same job. His medal citation said, "For conspicuous gallantry in deliberately exposing himself to enemy fire to assist in locating enemy snipers. His coolness and courage directly resulted in the neutralization of numerous enemy positions." MacDonald survived the war and went home to Nova Scotia. He never talked about what he did, but a fellow veteran remembered, "Jimmy would show us his scars and laugh. Cheaper than target practice," he'd say. But I saw his hands shake whenever there was a loud noise. The war stayed with him forever. Even civilians became part of the story. A woman named Marie Lefebvre owned a farm near Neuville-Saint-Vaast. Her house was destroyed. Her fields were full of shell holes, but she refused to leave. She gave information to Canadian snipers about German movements. She risked her life to help them. After the war, she said, "The Canadians were polite, respectful. They treated me like a human being, not an obstacle. When they killed German snipers, they were protecting my home, my land." When the war ended in November 1918, something strange happened to the Canadian sniper program. It disappeared almost overnight. By 1919, the schools were closed. The training manuals were put away. The systematic record-keeping stopped. All that careful organization and all those hard-won lessons seemed to vanish like smoke. The veterans came home, and most of them never talked about what they had done. Society didn't want to hear about killing. People wanted to forget the war and move on with their lives. For many of the snipers, coming home was harder than fighting. Francis Pagahma-Gabo returned to the Wasauksing First Nation. He had killed more enemy soldiers than any other sniper in the entire war. But he came home to poverty and discrimination. Native veterans were treated badly by the Canadian government. They didn't get the same benefits as white soldiers. Pagahma-Gabo spent the rest of his life fighting for indigenous rights and veteran recognition. He received the military medal with 2 bars, but that was all. Other men who had done far less received higher honors. He died in 1952, mostly forgotten by the country he had served so well. Henry Norwest never made it home. He was killed 85 days before the war ended. He was buried in France, thousands of miles from Alberta. His grave sits among thousands of other white crosses. His story was almost lost to history. But the German military never forgot what the Canadians had done. German officers after the war studied Canadian sniper methods carefully. They wrote reports. They analyzed what went wrong. When Germany rebuilt its military in the 1930s, they used lessons learned from fighting Canadian snipers. In the Second World War, German snipers were much better trained than they had been in the First World War. But even then, they never achieved the same systematic effectiveness that the Canadians had shown. The memory of Vimy Ridge became important to Canada. In 1936, Canada built a massive memorial on the ridge. It stands on the same ground that Canadian snipers helped capture in April 1917. The memorial is huge, made of white stone, with 2 towers reaching toward the sky. It honors 11,285 Canadian soldiers who were killed in France and have no known grave. Some of those names belong to snipers. The memorial doesn't specifically mention the sniper campaign, but without those snipers, Vimy Ridge might never have been captured. It took a long time for Canada to properly honor Francis Pegamagabo. In 2003, 51 years after his death, he was inducted into Canada's Aboriginal Veterans Honor Roll. In 2016, the Canadian Navy commissioned a new ship. They named it HMCS Pegamagabo. Finally, his name would sail the oceans. Finally, people would ask who he was and learn his story. The Canadian War Museum in Ottawa has a permanent exhibit about First World War snipers. You can see their rifles there. You can see their logbooks with careful handwriting recording each kill. You can see their personal items. One display case shows something chilling. It's a German sniper scope with a bullet hole through the lens. That was the last thing that German sniper ever saw. A Canadian bullet coming through his own scope. The Canadian sniper methods changed military training forever. In the Second World War, Soviet snipers studied Canadian First World War tactics. The famous American Marine Corps Scout Sniper program was built on Canadian ideas. Even today, modern military sniper schools around the world teach methods that came from those Canadian hunters in 1915. The paired spotter-shooter team that every military uses now, that was a Canadian innovation. The detailed record-keeping and systematic observation, Canadian. The emphasis on patience over aggression, Canadian. German-Canadian relations after the First World War were complicated. German veterans privately admitted that Canadian forces had been their most difficult opponents. In 1932, a German veterans magazine published an article called Der Kanadische Geist, which means the Canadian spirit. The article tried to explain why Canadians had been so effective. The conclusion was they fought as individuals within a disciplined structure. Each man was a thinking, acting weapon, not merely a cog in a machine. The Canadian sniper's success helped build Canada's national identity. Before the First World War, Canada was seen as just a colony of Britain, but Canadian soldiers proved they could fight as well as or better than any army in the world. Vimy Ridge became a symbol of Canadian capability and independence. When Canadians think of Vimy as a defining moment in their history, many don't realize that the victory was made possible by snipers who killed German observers days and weeks before the battle. Historian Tim Cook wrote, "Canadian snipers in World War I were not just killing enemy soldiers. They were, shot by shot, building a nation's reputation for professionalism, capability, and lethality. But many snipers paid a terrible price for their service." Herbert McBride survived the war and wrote his memoir. But even he struggled with what he had done. He wrote, "I killed 115 men. Each one had a family, a life, a future I erased. I tell myself it was necessary, that I was a soldier doing his duty. Some nights I believe it. Other nights I see 115 faces." James MacDonald, the brave decoy man who exposed himself to enemy fire to save his friends, committed suicide in 1934. The war had ended 16 years earlier, but he never truly escaped it. His sister said, "The war ended, but Jimmy never came home." Not really. Today, every military sniper school in the world begins training with a history lesson. Instructors teach about First World War Canadian snipers. They explain that modern sniper doctrine, the emphasis on observation, systematic elimination, and psychological warfare, all started with hunters from rural Canada who brought their wilderness skills to industrial warfare. Every year on November 11th, Canada observes Remembrance Day. On that day, Canadian military snipers lay a special wreath. It honors Francis Pegamagabo, Henry Norwest, and all the unnamed Indigenous soldiers who helped define Canadian military excellence. Their story is finally being told. What does this story teach us? It shows that warfare isn't just about having the biggest army or the best weapons. It's about intelligence, discipline, and the courage to face your enemy with skill and determination. Those Canadian snipers, many from marginalized communities, many with no formal military training, took the skills they learned hunting in the wilderness and applied them to modern war. They proved that systematic preparation and individual excellence could defeat superior numbers and equipment. General Arthur Currie, who commanded the Canadian Corps, understood what the snipers had accomplished. In 1919, he wrote, "Our snipers taught us that war is won not by who fires the most bullets, but by who fires the right bullets at the right time. They turned the Western Front's deadliest job into a science. They made German soldiers afraid to look over their own trenches. They won battles before the infantry ever left their lines. We owe them more than we can ever repay." In the Canadian War Museum, today there hangs a photograph from May 1917, taken just after Vimy Ridge was captured. It shows a Canadian sniper team silhouetted against the dawn light. One man holds binoculars. The other holds a Ross rifle. Behind them, no man's land stretches empty and quiet. The Germans are there somewhere, but they're not visible. They're keeping their heads down. They're staying hidden. They're staying alive. The Canadians own the battlefield, one careful shot at a time. That photograph captures everything. A small group of patient, skilled hunters who taught an empire to fear them.